The desert doesn't care for morals. It only understands survival. For Emma Vance, a woman clinging to the frayed edges of hope in the vast, unforgiving Arizona territory, survival meant her horse. Jasper was her legs, her freedom, her only companion in a land that swallowed souls whole. But on a blistering Tuesday, under a sun that offered no mercy, she was faced with a choice that defied all logic, a choice that would be whispered in saloons and around campfires for years. Before her lay a dying man, an enemy by blood and creed, a wounded Apache warrior, and the only thing that could save him was the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. The heat was a physical presence in the San Simon Valley. It shimmered above the cracked earth, distorting the distant mesas into drunken, wavering shapes. Emma Vance shielded her eyes, the worn leather of her gloves a familiar comfort against her skin. Dust fine as powdered bone coated everything, her split riding skirt, the sweat sheen on her mare's neck, and the very air she breathed. Jasper, her sturdy buckskin, was the last tangible piece of her old life, a wedding gift from a husband the earth had claimed 2 winters ago. Now the horse was her only partner in this desperate pilgrimage toward a plot of land near Fort Grant, a place she'd only seen on a deed. She had been following the faint trace of a dry wash, a supposed shortcut recommended by a grizzled prospector in Lordsburg when she saw it. Not the man at first, but the unnatural smear of crimson against the ochre rock. It was a dark, wet stain, too vibrant to be mineral. Jasper snorted, his ears twitching, and Emma's hand instinctively went to the Winchester rifle holstered beside her saddle. This was Apache land, a truth spoken in hushed, fearful tones by every settler she'd met. The Chiricahua were ghosts of the mountains, shadows who fought a bitter war against the encroaching world. Dismounting, she moved with a caution born of solitude. The silence of the desert was deceptive. It was never truly empty. She rounded a cluster of monolithic sandstone boulders, their surfaces baked by 1,000 years of sun, and her breath caught in her throat. He was sprawled in the sliver of shade offered by an overhang. An Apache warrior. His body was lean and corded with muscle, his long black hair matted with sweat and dirt. A crude, bloody bandage was tied around his left thigh, soaked through. A more grievous wound marred his side, a ragged tear in his buckskin shirt, from which blood still sluggishly oozed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rasping breaths. He was alone. No horse, no companions. Just a man bleeding his life into the sand. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the haze of heat. Her mind screamed the warning she'd heard 100 times. They're savages. Killers. An Apache is only good dead. Her fingers tightened on the rifle's stock. It would be easy. Prudent. An act of self-preservation. Her presence here was a trespass. His very existence was a threat. She raised the rifle, the metal hot against her palm, and sighted down the barrel. His face was turned towards her, his eyes closed. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips cracked and pale. He looked young, no older than her own 24 years. A faint groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure animal pain that cut through the dogma and the fear. It wasn't the sound of a monster or a demon. It was the sound of a man dying. Her rifle lowered an inch. What was she doing, she who had once nursed a lame coyote pup back to health against all common sense? She who believed every living thing had a right to its own struggle. This was different, the world told her. This was us versus them. But as she looked at him, stripped of his weapons, and his tribe dying alone under the indifferent sky, she didn't see a warrior. She saw a son, a brother, perhaps a husband. She saw a human being. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned the Winchester against the rock and unslung her canteen. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. She uncorked the canteen and gently lifted his head. His eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep-set, and for a moment they held a flicker of defiant fire before clouding with pain and confusion. He saw her a white woman, and a guttural sound, a weak attempt at a warning or a curse rumbled in his chest. "Hush now," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. "Just drink." She tilted the canteen to his lips. He resisted at first, a primal mistrust warring with a desperate thirst. But the body's needs are more fundamental than its hatreds. He drank, his throat working convulsively. When he was done, he slumped back, his eyes closing again. Now came the wounds. Her medical knowledge was rudimentary, learned from necessity and her late mother's journals. She tore strips from her spare petticoat, a garment she'd cherished, one of the last fine things she owned. Her hands trembled as she untied the crude bandage on his thigh. A bullet wound, clean through the muscle but festering in the heat. The gash in his side was worse, likely from a fall against sharp rock. It needed stitching, a doctor, things she could not provide. She did what she could. She cleaned the wounds with the last of her precious water, hissing through her teeth at his sharp intakes of breath. He was conscious, watching her through slitted eyes, his face, an unreadable mask of pain. She packed the wounds with yarrow she found, growing nearby, a trick an old Mexican woman had taught her, and bound them tightly with her clean linen. As she worked, the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and violet. The desert cooled rapidly, and a new danger presented itself. He wouldn't survive a night in the open in his condition, nor, she realized with a growing knot of dread in her stomach, would he survive being found by the patrol that had likely wounded him. She looked at him, then at Jasper, who watched them with intelligent, patient eyes. The horse was her life. Her entire future was tied up in reaching her homestead, and Jasper was the only way to get there with her meager supplies. To lose him was to lose everything. It was to strand herself in this wilderness, trading his certain death for her own possible one. It was insane. It was suicide. His eyes were open again, fixed on her. The fiery defiance was gone, replaced by a raw, weary understanding. He knew what she was doing for him, and he knew the cost. In that shared gaze, a silent transaction took place. It wasn't about race or war. It was about a life given and a debt acknowledged. With a sigh that felt like it was pulled from the depths of her soul, Emma stood up. She walked to Jasper and stroked his soft nose, burying her face in his mane for a moment. "Forgive me, boy," she whispered. She led the horse to the wounded warrior. The man pushed himself up on one elbow, his face contorted in a silent question. Emma gestured from him to the horse. She made a motion of riding, pointing east towards the distant, jagged peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains. Go. Live. Getting him onto the saddle was an agonizing ordeal. He was weak, and every movement sent tremors of pain through his body. She half lifted, half dragged him, his weight a heavy burden. Finally, he was slumped over Jasper's back, clinging weakly to the saddle horn. She tied the reins loosely to his hand. He would have to guide the horse with what little strength he had left. He looked down at her, a tall, solitary woman, silhouetted against the dying light. His face was still a mask, but his eyes held a profound, burning intensity. He spoke a single word in his language, a word that was soft and guttural and utterly foreign to her ears. It was not a thank you. It felt like something heavier. A promise, perhaps, or a name. Kyle. Then he nudged Jasper with his good leg. The horse, loyal to the last, gave Emma one final questioning look before turning and beginning a slow, steady walk towards the deepening shadows of the mountains. Emma Vance stood alone, the silence rushing back in to fill the space Jasper had occupied. She had her rifle, a half-empty canteen, a small satchel of dried jerky and hardtack, and the clothes on her back. Fort Grant was at least 2 days' ride. On foot it could be a week if she didn't lose her way. If the water held out, if she wasn't found by coyotes or snakes or men worse than either. She had given her only horse to a wounded Apache, and now she had to walk alone through the desert until dawn. The magnitude of her act settled upon her not with regret, but with the cold, stark terror of its consequences. The first hour of walking was fueled by a strange, adrenaline-laced clarity. The setting sun bled across the horizon, and the world cooled with an almost audible sigh of relief. Emma pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the North Star, her compass, in the vast, darkening expanse. The tracks left by Jasper and his rider were faint, but present a ghostly trail leading away from her, a constant reminder of the choice she had made. She did not follow them. Her path lay west towards the promise of civilization, however flawed it might be. As twilight deepened into true night, the desert transformed. The familiar shapes of cacti and yucca became monstrous silhouettes. Every rustle in the sagebrush sent a jolt of fear through her. The howling of a distant coyote was a lonely, predatory sound that seemed to mock her solitude. She was a trespasser here, a soft, vulnerable creature far from her natural habitat. Her thoughts, which had been a whirlwind of fear and justification, began to slow and turn inward. She thought of her husband, William. He had been a good man, a kind man, but a dreamer. He saw this arid land not as it was, but as it could be, a green pasture, a thriving ranch. He had never understood its teeth. He would have called her a fool for what she'd done. A soft-hearted, reckless fool. Emma, she could almost hear his gentle, chiding voice. Compassion is a virtue, but not at the cost of your own life. Perhaps he was right. The ache in her feet was already a dull throb. The water in her canteen, when she allowed herself a small sip, was warm and tasted of tin. It did little to quench the thirst that was becoming a constant sandpaper rasp in her throat. Hours bled into one another. The moon rose a sliver of bone white in an ink-black sky, offering just enough light to see the ground before her. She developed a rhythm walk. Breathe, scan the horizon. Listen. Repeat. Her mind drifted untethered. She remembered her childhood in Ohio, the damp, loamy smell of the earth after a rainstorm, the feel of thick grass under her bare feet. It felt like a different planet. Had she really once lived in a world with so much water, so much green around what she guessed was midnight? She stumbled. Her boot caught on a root, and she went down hard, the impact jarring her teeth. The rifle clattered against the rocks. She lay there for a long moment, the sharp sting of scraped palms, and the overwhelming desire to simply not get up, washing over her. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the cool night air leach the warmth from her body, to surrender to the vast indifference of the landscape. No. The word was a silent scream in her own mind. She was not a woman who surrendered. She had survived William's death from cholera, survived the swindlers who had tried to cheat her out of her inheritance, survived the grueling journey this far west. She would not be broken by a patch of dirt and a long walk. Pushing herself up, she took stock. Her hands were bleeding, but not badly. Her canteen had a new dent in it, but it hadn't burst. She took another sip, smaller this time, forcing herself to ration the precious liquid. As she retrieved her rifle, her fingers brushed against the smooth, worn stock. It was her only defense. She wasn't just Emma Vance, the widow. Out here she was a fighter. She had to be. The encounter with the Apache warrior, Cale, she thought his name, was played over and over in her mind. The look in his eyes. It wasn't gratitude. It was deeper, more complex. It was a look of recognition, as if he saw past her skin, color, her gender, her fear, and saw the core of her, the part that had made the impossible choice. He had seen her, and in turn she had seen him. In that moment, by the rock, the centuries of hatred and bloodshed between their peoples had evaporated, leaving only two human beings in a desperate situation. She had not saved him out of some grand political statement or a misguided sense of romanticism. She had done it because when she looked at him, she saw a life worth saving, and she possessed the means to save it. It was a simple, brutal calculus. His life for her horse, his life for her safety. A new sound pricked her ears, different from the coyotes. It was the low, rhythmic beat of hoofs. More than one. Panic seized her. She scrambled behind a thicket of mesquite, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She peered through the thorny branches. In the moonlight, she could make out a line of riders, perhaps 5 or 6 of them, moving steadily from the west. A patrol settlers. They drew closer, and she could hear the murmur of voices, the jingle of harnesses. They were white men, armed. A posse. As they passed her hiding spot, the moonlight caught the face of the man in the lead. He was tall with a severe face and a long duster coat. A silver star was pinned to his vest. But it wasn't a sheriff's star. It was the mark of a civilian contractor, a U.S. deputy marshal, or more likely, a bounty hunter sanctioned by the army. He can't have gotten far. The lead man said, his voice, a low growl that carried in the still air. Jedediah said he winged him good. We find his horse. We find him. $100 for the scalp, boys. $500 if you bring back the man they call Cale alive. Emma's blood ran cold. Kyle. They were hunting him by name. This wasn't a random skirmish. He was important, and she had just sent him away on a horse that would leave a trail a child could follow. What about the other tracks, Mr. Thorne? Another rider asked. The shod horse looked like it was with him for a bit. The leader, Elias Thorne, reined in his horse. A settler, maybe, or a sympathizer. If we find them, they'll tell us what they know, one way or another. The implication was clear, hanging in the cold night air like a death sentence. They weren't just hunting Cale. They would be hunting for anyone who helped him. They would be hunting for her. The posse rode on their dark shapes, disappearing into the gloom. Emma remained crouched in the mesquite, trembling, a new and more terrifying fear gripping her. Her act of compassion had not ended the conflict. It had plunged her directly into the heart of it. She was no longer just a woman stranded in the desert. She was a fugitive, an accomplice, and the men hunting Kyle would show her no more mercy than they would show him. She waited until the sound of their horses had faded completely, then forced herself to her feet. Her thirst, her exhaustion, her loneliness, they were all eclipsed by this new, urgent terror. Walking until dawn was no longer the challenge. The challenge was surviving what came after. Dawn broke not with gentle pastels, but with a fierce, bloody gash across the eastern sky. The light brought no comfort, only a stark illumination of Emma's vulnerability. The desert floor stretched out in every direction, offering scant cover. Every shadow was shallow, every rock a temporary reprieve. She was a solitary figure in a vast, exposed landscape, and she knew Elias Thorne and his men would be able to see for miles. Her path had become a desperate calculation. She could no longer walk a straight line west. She had to assume the posse would backtrack looking for the sympathizer, She veered south, moving from one cluster of boulders to the next, staying in the winding, sandy bottoms of arroyos whenever possible. It was slower, more grueling work, and every step took a toll on her dwindling energy. The sun climbed, resuming its relentless assault. Her canteen was dangerously light. She resisted the urge to drain it, her tongue thick and swollen in her mouth. Her thoughts grew fuzzy, her focus narrowing to the simple, agonizing act of putting one foot in front of the other. The image of Elias Thorne's cold, predatory eyes was burned into her mind. He was not a lawman seeking justice. He was a hunter tracking valuable prey. And Cale, the man whose life she had saved, was worth $500. What she wondered with a sickening lurch in her stomach was the penalty for aiding him late in the afternoon, as she huddled in the meager shade of a stunted Palo Verde tree. She saw them, a dust cloud on the northern horizon. It was them. They were sweeping the area in a grid, methodical and patient. They were professionals. Panic raw and primal threatened to overwhelm her. There was nowhere to run. She was a fly on a dinner plate, and they were closing in. Her eyes darted around her barren surroundings, rock sand cacti, and then she saw it, a narrow fissure in the side of a low-lying butte a few hundred yards away. It wasn't a cave, more like a deep crack in the rock, but it was her only chance. Forcing her protesting legs into a stumbling run, she half ran, half fell toward the butte. The sand dragged at her boots. Her lungs burned. She could hear the faint sound of their voices, now carried on the wind. She threw herself towards the fissure, squeezing her body into the tight, claustrophobic space. It was barely wide enough for her shoulders, the rock rough and cool against her cheek. She wedged herself as far back as she could, pulling her rifle in after her, and held her breath. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a thundering that seemed to vibrate through the very rock she was hiding in. They were close, terribly close. "Track's end here," a voice called out. It was Thorne. "She went aground somewhere around this butte. Spread out. Check every crack." Emma's heart felt like it would explode. She pressed herself harder against the stone, making herself small, willing herself to become invisible. She could hear the crunch of boots on gravel just outside her hiding place. A shadow fell across the opening of the fissure. Anything Billy Thorne's voice was right there. Just a crack, boss. Too narrow for a man to fit. Check it anyway. A snake can hide in a boot. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. She could hear the man Billy grunting as he approached. She smelled the sour scent of his sweat of chewing tobacco. She prepared herself for the inevitable discovery for the rough hands, dragging her out for the cold barrel of a gun against her temple. Her hand tightened on her Winchester. If they found her, she would not go quietly. A boot scuffed the rock near the entrance. A long silence stretched thick with tension. Then a sharp hiss. "Whoa, Rattler!" Billy yelled, scrambling backward. "Big one coiled up right in the damn entrance." "Leave it," Thorne commanded, his voice impatient. "She ain't in there with a diamondback. Keep looking. Circle the butte. She's here somewhere." The footsteps moved away. Emma didn't dare breathe. A rattlesnake. She hadn't seen or heard one. Was it a lie, a stroke of incredible luck, or was there truly a deadly serpent guarding her sanctuary? She couldn't risk looking. She remained perfectly still, listening as the sounds of the search party receded, then faded altogether. For what felt like an eternity, she stayed wedged in the rock, every muscle screaming in protest. Only when the sun began to dip low again, casting long, cool shadows, did she dare to slowly, cautiously peer out. The desert was empty. The posse was gone for now. There was no sign of a rattlesnake. Billy had either lied to avoid the effort of a proper search, or had mistaken a shadow for a threat. Either way, she had been saved by a phantom. She crawled out of the fissure, her body stiff and trembling, with the aftermath of terror She was alive, but the encounter had stripped her of her last reserves of strength. Her canteen was empty. She had finished the last of her water while hiding her throat raw with fear. Now a new, more insidious enemy took hold delirium. As dusk fell, the landscape began to play tricks on her. Rocks took on the shape of crouching men. The whisper of the wind sounded like her name. She saw William standing on a distant ridge, beckoning to her, his form shimmering in the heat haze. She knew it wasn't real, but the longing to go to him, to lay her head on his shoulder and rest, was almost overpowering. She stumbled on, driven by sheer, stubborn will. She thought of Kyle. Had he made it? Was Jasper carrying him to safety? Or had the posse found his trail? She prayed for his survival, not for his sake alone, but for hers. If he died, her sacrifice would have been for nothing. A meaningless gesture that would end with her own bones bleaching under the sun. Her act of compassion needed to have meant something. Night fell again. This time there was no moon. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that hid both threats and salvation. She tripped and fell again and again. Her body was a symphony of pain. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her mind was a fog of thirst-driven hallucinations and disjointed memories. She was crawling her hands raw from the sand and gravel when she saw the light. At first she thought it was another trick of her mind. A faint, flickering yellow glow, low to the ground, far in the distance. A star that had fallen to earth. But it didn't move. It was constant. A campfire. Hope, a feeling so alien it was almost painful, surged through her. A campfire meant people. Water. Safety. It could be Thorne's men, but she was past caring. To die by a bullet was better than this slow, agonizing dissolution into dust. With the last of her strength, she began to crawl toward the light. It was an agonizingly slow journey. The light seemed to retreat with every foot she gained. She was weeping without tears, her body shuddering with dry sobs. Finally collapsing onto a small rise, she saw the source. It was a small, solitary cabin nestled in a hollow, a single lantern glowing in its window. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. She tried to call out, but only a hoarse croak escaped her lips. She could go no further. Using her last ounce of will, she raised her rifle and, pointing it toward the sky, pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot was shockingly loud in the stillness. It echoed off the distant rocks, a desperate final plea. Then the world tilted the light of the cabin, dissolving into a black, swirling void. Emma Vance knew no more. She awoke to the scent of coffee and wood smoke. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn wooden beams, unfamiliar and solid. She was lying on a narrow cot covered by a thick wool blanket. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she tried to sit up. "Easy there, young lady. You've had a rough go of it." The voice was calm and steady. A man sat in a simple wooden chair by a small stone fireplace. He was older, with a fringe of grey hair, kind eyes behind spectacles, and hands stained with what looked like ink and something medicinal. The cabin was small and cluttered, lined with books and shelves filled with glass jars containing herbs and tinctures. It smelled of dried plants, old paper, and antiseptic. "Where?" Emma's voice was a dry whisper. "You're at my clinic." Such as it is, the man said with a wry smile. "Name's Dr. Samuel Abernathy. I'm the physician for the mining camp a few miles east of here. Found you collapsed about a mile out after I heard your signal shot last night. You're lucky. Another few hours out there." He didn't need to finish the sentence. He handed her a cup of water, and she drank it with a desperation that bordered on pain. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you." She managed the simple words, feeling wholly inadequate. "All in a day's work," Dr. Abernathy said, his eyes studying her with professional curiosity. "You have severe dehydration exhaustion and a nasty collection of scrapes. But what I'm more curious about is what a woman like you was doing wandering the desert alone, without a horse or supplies." The question hung in the air, Emma's mind now clear of the delirium raced. The truth was dangerous. A lie would be difficult to sustain. The posse Elias Thorne, they would surely pass through this area. "My horse went lame," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "Had to shoot him. I was trying to get to Fort Grant. My late husband, left me a small parcel of land there." The doctor nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A terrible piece of luck. Fort Grant is still a good 30 miles from here. You wouldn't have made it." He seemed to accept her story, but a flicker of doubt remained in his eyes. He was a man who had seen much of the world and its troubles, and her story was thin. For 2 days, Emma recovered under the doctor's care. He was a kind, educated man from Boston, who spoke of his past with a melancholic air. He asked no more prying questions, and Emma offered no more information. She learned that the nearby settlement named Dusty Perdition's Rise was a temporary silver mining camp, a rough place full of rough men. Dr. Abernathy served as their doctor-pastor and postmaster, a lone beacon of civility in a sea of greed and grit. On the 3rd morning, their quiet convalescence was shattered. The sound of approaching horses sent the doctor to the window. His face grew grim. "Company," he said, his voice low, and not the pleasant kind. Emma's heart sank. Through the window, she saw them, Elias Thorne and his posse, reining in their horses outside the cabin. Thorne dismounted his movements, economical and predatory. He was not a man who wasted motion. "Stay here, and stay quiet," the doctor ordered, before stepping outside. Emma crept to the window, her body tense. Morning Doc Thorne said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "We're tracking a Chiricahua renegade, name of Kyle, wounded. You seen anyone or anything unusual pass this way? The only unusual thing I've seen is a group of armed men disturbing my morning coffee," Dr. Abernathy retorted dryly. "What business does the army have with this Kale not army business?" "Private contract," Thorne corrected him smoothly. "He's a murderer, escaped custody down near the border. We also have reason to believe he was aided by a woman, a settler. Young, dark hair, traveling alone." "Seen her?" The doctor hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "You're a poor liar, Samuel. We followed tracks to within a mile of this cabin. A single set of boots stumbling, then a gunshot. You brought someone in 2 nights ago." Dr. Abernathy straightened his gentle demeanor, replaced by a steely resolve. "I am a doctor, Mr. Thorne. I render aid to those who need it without prejudice. The woman inside is my patient." "Is she now?" Thorne pushed past the doctor and strode into the cabin. His cold eyes landed on Emma, who stood frozen by the cot. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what the desert coughed up. You've led us a merry chase, miss." "I don't know what you're talking about," Emma said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Don't you?" Thorne circled her like a wolf. "We found the place, a shod horse and a moccasin, print side by side, blood on the rocks, the horse tracks leading east toward the mountains, your tracks leading west. It's a simple story. You found our wounded Apache, patched him up, and gave him your horse. That makes you an accessory. It makes you a traitor." "She was delirious when I found her," Dr. Abernathy interjected, stepping back inside. "Exhausted. She's not fit for questioning." Thorne ignored him, his focus entirely on Emma. "Here's how this is going to work. You are going to tell me everything you know. Which way he was headed, any words you exchanged, what his plans were. You will help us find him. If you cooperate, the commander at Fort Grant might be lenient. If you don't—" He let the threat hang in the air, more potent for being unspoken. Emma's mind was a whirlwind. Her lie had collapsed. The truth was her only option, but the truth was a death sentence for Kyle, and perhaps for her. She thought of the look in Kyle's eyes, the unspoken covenant. She thought of Thorne's casual brutality. She lifted her chin. "I found a wounded man, I helped him. I would have done the same for a dog. That's all I have to say." Thorne's smile vanished. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think this is a game? You think your morals matter out here? That Apache you saved isn't just some raider? Do you even know who he is?" Emma remained silent. Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound. "His name is Kyle. He's the son of Cochise's cousin, a leader, a voice for war among the last of the free Chiricahua. The army wants him silenced, but a private consortium of railroad men and silver barons wants him more. They want him to sign away rights to the land in those mountains land that's full of silver. He's the key. And you little lady, you just let him slip through our fingers." The revelation struck Emma with the force of a physical blow. This was not about justice or revenge. It was about money, about land. She hadn't just saved a man. She had interfered in the relentless march of power and greed. "She knows nothing," Dr. Abernathy insisted. "She will." Thorne snarled. "She's coming with us. We'll take her to Fort Grant. A few days in a hot, dusty cell will loosen her tongue." He gestured to two of his men. "Tie her hands. She can ride double with Billy." Emma didn't resist as they bound her wrists in front of her. Her mind was reeling. She had thought her ordeal was over. But it was only just beginning. As they led her from the cabin into the blinding sunlight, she met Dr. Abernathy's eyes. He gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a look that conveyed a message of silent support, a promise that this was not over. But as she was roughly hoisted onto the back of a horse, sandwiched between the grimy Billy and the endless desert, she felt a despair colder and deeper than any she had felt while walking alone. She had tried to do one good thing, and it had entangled her in a web of violence and greed far beyond her comprehension. She was a prisoner, a pawn in a rich man's game, and her only hope for survival lay with the very man she had sent away. The journey to Fort Grant was a study in misery. The sun beat down, the dust kicked up by the horses formed a choking cloud, and the crude jokes of Thorne's men were a constant, grating presence. Emma was treated not as a person, but as cargo, a piece of evidence. Billy, the man she rode with, smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed wool, and his proximity was a constant violation. Thorne rode at the head of the column, confident and implacable. He questioned her relentlessly for the first few hours, his inquiries like sharp, probing needles. Did he speak to you? Did he say where he was going? A landmark? A name? Emma's response was always the same, a tight-lipped silence. Her defiance seemed to amuse him at first, but as the miles wore on, his patience frayed. "You're protecting a savage who would have slit your throat for your horse if he'd been strong enough," he sneered, riding alongside her. "He's not your friend. His people have been burning ranches and killing families in this valley for 20 years. What makes you so special?" She refused to look at him, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains to the east. Kyle's mountains. A silent prayer formed in her heart, a desperate plea for his safety. Her own fate felt sealed, but his survival still mattered. It was the only thing that gave her sacrifice meaning. They made camp that night in a shallow canyon. Emma's hands were untied, long enough for her to eat a piece of hardtack and drink from a shared canteen, always under the watchful eye of a guard. The men drank whiskey and spoke in low voices around the fire. She caught snippets of their conversation. They weren't lawmen. They were hired guns, drawn by the promise of Thorne's bounty. Their loyalty was to money, not justice. As she lay on the hard ground, her wrists bound again, she overheard a conversation between Thorne and his second-in-command, a grizzled man named Marcus. "Are you sure the fort is the right move? Elias." Marcus asked, his voice a low rumble. "Colonel Whitman is a stickler for the rules. He might not take kindly to us bringing in a civilian woman in ropes." "Whitman is a fool," Thorne spat. "But he's a useful one. We hand her over, tell him she's an Apache sympathizer obstructing a government-sanctioned operation. He'll lock her up. The pressure will break her. When she gives us Cale's location, we ride out, collect our prize. And by the time Whitman files his paperwork, we'll be halfway to Tucson with a signed treaty and a fat bonus. The fort is just a tool." The cold, calculated cynicism of his plan chilled Emma to the bone. She was a key to be used, a lock to be picked. Her life, her rights, they were irrelevant. Sleep was impossible. Her mind raced, searching for any escape, any leverage. There was none. She was trapped. She thought of Dr. Abernathy. His final supportive glance had been a small comfort. But what could one old doctor do against men like these? The next morning, as they prepared to leave, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at a gallop from the direction of Perdition's Rise. It was one of the miners from the camp. He reined in his horse, his face flush with excitement and alarm. "Mr. Thorne, you need to see this," he gasped, panting. "The old doc's place. It was raided." "Last night." Thorne's head snapped up. "Raided by who? Apaches?" "Don't think so," the miner said. "It was strange. His medical supplies are gone. Bandages, laudanum, carbolic acid, suture kits, all of it. But his money box wasn't touched. And his books, his personal things, all left alone. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for." Emma's heart gave a powerful leap. Medical supplies. Thorne's eyes narrowed, a dark, furious intelligence dawning in them. He stared east towards the mountains. "It wasn't a raid," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "It was a rescue mission. For supplies." He turned his cold gaze on Emma, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than contempt. It was a sliver of respect, a grudging acknowledgement of his opponent. He didn't run. The bastard didn't run. Kyle was close. He was hurt, but he was alive, and he was thinking. He hadn't abandoned her to her fate. He knew she would be captured, and he knew she was his only link to real medicine. The raid on Dr. Abernathy's clinic wasn't random. It was a message. And it was a move on the chessboard that Thorne hadn't anticipated. "He's watching us," Marcus said, his hand straying to his pistol. The other men grew uneasy, scanning the silent, empty ridges that surrounded them. The vast, open desert no longer felt empty. It felt like it had eyes. Thorne's plan changed instantly. "Forget Fort Grant," he commanded, his voice sharp with new urgency. "He's trying to draw us into the mountains. He's wounded. He needs those supplies, and he's not moving fast. We're not waiting for her to talk. We're going to use her as bait." A new, more terrifying chapter of her ordeal began. They turned east directly towards the jagged peaks of the Chiricahua Range. Emma was no longer a prisoner being transported. She was a lure. Her hands were untied, but she was placed on her own horse, a short rope connecting her saddle to Thorne's. She was the tethered goat staked out for the lion. As they rode, the landscape changed. The flat desert floor gave way to rolling foothills, dotted with ocotillo and agave. They entered a labyrinth of canyons and dry riverbeds, the towering rock formations, creating a maze of shadows and echoes. This was his territory. Every instinct in Emma's body screamed that they were riding into a trap. Thorn knew it too, but his arrogance and the promise of his prize drove him forward. He believed his superior numbers and firepower would prevail. That afternoon, they found a sign. A single eagle feather carefully placed on a high rock overlooking the trail, pointing further into a narrow, winding canyon. "A sign," Marcus grunted. "He's leading us on." "I know," Thorn said, a grim smile on his face. "He wants us to follow. He thinks he controls the game." Emma looked at the feather. It wasn't just a signpost. It was a symbol, a communication. It felt personal, as if it were meant for her. It was a whisper from the mountain, a confirmation that he was there, that he was aware. It was a promise. They ventured deeper into the canyon. The walls grew steeper, closing in around them, the sky reduced to a narrow ribbon of blue above. The air grew still and silent. The usual desert sounds vanished. The only noise was the clink of their harnesses and the soft plod of their horses' hooves in the sand. The silence was heavy, watchful. Billy the rider, who had been her guard, licked his dry lips. "I don't like this, Elias. It feels wrong." "Shut up and keep your eyes open," Thorn snapped, but even he seemed affected by the oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, from high up on the canyon rim, a rock dislodged. It wasn't large, but it tumbled down the cliff face, gathering speed, clattering loudly, before landing in the sand, just feet from Thorn's horse. The animal shied violently. Every man drew his weapon, their heads snapping up, scanning the empty-looking cliffs. There was nothing there. Just rock and sky. It could have been an accident, a natural occurrence. But everyone knew it wasn't. It was a warning, a demonstration of control. It was Cale, unseen, unheard, announcing his presence. He was telling them and telling Emma that he was here. The hunter had just become the hunted, and she was standing right in the middle of the trap. The dislodged rock was a punctuation mark ending the posse's confident advance and beginning a new chapter of fear. Kyle was no longer just the hunted. He was a ghost in his own canyons, and Thorn's men felt it in their bones. Their swagger dissolved into a tense, nervous vigilance, their eyes constantly scanning the silent, watchful rims of the canyon. Kyle was turning their numbers into a liability, making them a large, clumsy target in a space he could navigate with silent ease. An hour later, his second message came. An arrow fletched with hawk feathers thudded into the sand just ahead of the lead horse. Its tip was not sharpened stone, but a simple bundle of red cloth. It was not an attack. It was a statement. "I am here. I am watching." This could have been a heart. The men panicked, firing their rifles wildly at the cliffs. The shots echoed deafeningly, a futile tantrum against an invisible enemy. Thorn roared at them to hold their fire, his face a mask of fury. "Fools, you're wasting ammunition on shadows." When the echoes died, Thorn dismounted and studied the arrow. A cruel intelligence glinted in his eyes as he looked at Emma. "He's sentimental," Thorn mused. "He won't risk hitting the woman. That's our advantage." He seized the rope connecting Emma's horse to his and dragged her to the front of the column, positioning her directly beside him. Emma's blood ran cold. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a human shield. The hope that had bloomed within her withered into a cold, hard knot of despair. Her one protector was now neutralized by his own compassion for her. They pushed deeper into the winding maze of rock. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows, they reached a dead end. A massive, ancient rockfall blocked the canyon floor. The only way forward was a narrow switchback trail snaking its way up the sheer canyon wall, a path barely wide enough for a single horse. A perfect ambush. Marcus Thorne, second in command, breathed his fear, palpable. "It's the only way." Thorne snarled his arrogance, refusing to yield. "He wants us on that path. We dismount. Lead the horses." He yanked on Emma's arm, forcing her to walk ahead of him on the treacherous trail. "She's my guarantee." The ascent was a nightmare of shifting scree and the nervous whinnies of the horses. Below them, the canyon floor dropped away into a deep, shadowy abyss. They were halfway up when Kyle finally made his move. It was not with an arrow, but with a sound. A single piercing war cry echoed from the cliffs above and behind them. It was immediately answered by another cry from the opposite side of the canyon, then a third, seeming to come from the very mouth of the canyon they had just left. The guards they'd left behind began shouting and firing blindly into the encroaching darkness. The posse on the trail froze, trapped. The psychological warfare had worked. The unseen enemy, the ghostly echoes from all sides, it shattered their nerve. "It's a trick!" Thorne yelled, his voice strained. "He's alone, he's throwing his voice." But his men were beyond reason. One of them screamed and scrambled back down the path. His panic was a contagion. In moments, the narrow trail was a scene of chaos as the men fled, shoving past each other in a desperate bid for self-preservation. Thorne, enraged, drew his pistol, but his authority was gone. His posse had disintegrated into a terrified mob. In that singular moment of chaos, Emma acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she wrenched her arm free from Thorne's loosened grasp. She didn't run down the path with the others. She ran up. "The woman," Thorne bellowed, turning to lunge after her. He was too late. From the rocks above, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the last of the twilight. It was Cale. He stood tall, a bow in his hand, his face a taut mask of pain and effort. And he was not alone. Behind him stood another figure, older and slighter, holding a rifle with a steady, familiar calm. It was Dr. Samuel Abernathy. "It's over, Thorne," the doctor called out, his voice firm. "Let her go." Thorne stared, stunned by the impossible appearance of the old doctor. He laughed, a ragged, incredulous sound. "You an old man and a wounded savage." But as he glanced back, he saw his men were gone, vanished into the gloom. He was alone. Cale knocked an arrow, the movement fluid and deadly. He aimed not at Thorne, but at the ground a foot from his boots. The message was absolute. The next one would not miss. Thorne's face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and utterly humiliated. With a final venomous glare at Emma, he turned and scrambled down the path, swallowed by the darkness. Silence returned to the canyon. Emma climbed the last few feet of the trail on unsteady legs and was met by the doctor. "I knew a man like Thorne wouldn't follow the rules," Dr. Abernathy explained quickly. "I followed their trail, found Cale yesterday. He was in a bad way, but we managed." Emma's gaze shifted to Cale. The strength he had projected was fading, replaced by a profound weariness. The fight had cost him dearly. She approached him slowly. "You came back," she said the words full of unspoken emotion. He met her gaze, his dark eyes holding a deep, unwavering respect. He said her name, Emma, and then gestured from her to his own chest and finally to the open sky above. The meaning was clear: you, me. We are even. They spent the night in a hidden alcove. As Dr. Abernathy tended to Cale's properly cleaned wounds, Emma learned the full truth. Thorne was not law, but a hired gun for a consortium of railroad and silver barons who wanted the land in these mountains. Kyle was the only leader with the authority and integrity to stand against them. The next morning, Kyle led them from the maze of rocks. In a small hidden pasture, several Apache ponies grazed. and among them, contentedly chewing on a patch of grass, was Jasper. Emma cried out with pure joy, running to throw her arms around her horse's neck. He was safe. He was whole. She turned to Kyle, her eyes shining with tears. "You kept him." He simply nodded. He had not just returned a horse. He had returned a piece of her life. Their time together was ending. At a fork in the trail, Kyle pointed west. "Fort Grant." He then pointed east to the towering peaks. "Home." "I'll see you safely to the main road, Emma," Dr. Abernathy promised. He turned to Kyle. "You should go. Thorn will be back." Kyle agreed with a nod. He looked at Emma, a long final appraisal. He stepped forward and gently touched the faint scar on her palm from her fall in the desert. Then he touched a long, puckered scar on his own forearm. He held his scarred hand up next to hers. It was not a gesture of pity, but of profound kinship. They were both survivors, marked by the harshness of this land and by the choices they had made. He spoke softly the same word from their first encounter. "He called you, 'my beautiful one,'" Dr. Abernathy translated. With a final lingering look that spoke more than words ever could, Kyle swung onto his pony. Without looking back, he rode east, a solitary figure, melting back into the mountains that were his lifeblood. Emma watched him go, then turned Jasper west. She was no longer the same woman who had entered the desert. She had walked alone through the fire and emerged, not burned, but forged. The story of Emma Vance and the warrior named Kyle is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the threads of humanity that connect us even in a world determined to tear us apart. It reminds us that our choices, especially the most difficult ones, define our character far more than the circumstances we are born into. Emma's journey through that unforgiving desert was not just a physical one. It was a journey into the heart of her own courage, proving that true strength isn't about the weapons we carry, but about the compassion we are willing to show when it costs us everything. Her story reminds us that beneath the labels of friend and foe, settler and savage, we are all just people struggling to survive under the same relentless sun. If this story of sacrifice, courage, and the unlikely bond forged in the heart of the Wild West moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more tales from the dusty trails of history to share with you. Thank you for listening.